Hello everyone, Mr. Stevens here with our first statistics lesson called Types of Data. And we're also looking at ways of collecting data as well. We got types of data, numerical and categorical. We've got sources of data, primary and secondary. And then we'll look at the difference between a census and a sample, ways of collecting data, as well as a few different types of samples. Lots of things to define in this lesson. So let's jump right in. The first one are the two different types of data, numerical or categorical. It's pretty easy to remember that numerical data is just data that's related to numbers. And categorical data is data where we're splitting things into groups. For example, what's your hair color? We can break down numerical data a little bit further. We've got discrete, which is basically integers, whole numbers. 1, 2, 3, 4. Continuous numerical data is where the numbers can be any value within a certain range. So decimals are fair game. And everything and anything in between. So if you need to pause here to finish writing some stuff down, go ahead. I'm going to jump into some examples. First one, I'm going to do this one. We're going to classify these things as either categorical or numerical. The first one, eye color of students in a class, it's breaking things down into groups. Therefore, it is categorical. You've got a bunch of different categories like blue, brown, hazel, green. The second one though, temperature of the classroom, it's numerical. Is it discrete or is it continuous? It can be any number we need it to be. 25.3 degrees is valid. So it's going to be continuous. I'd like you guys, if you think you're pretty confident, pause here, have a go at these. I'm going to throw up the answers in a second. Number of cars per household. This is actually an example. It's obviously numerical. It's going to be a number. It's actually an example of discrete numerical. Because it's impossible to have 2.3 cars. Cars only exist in one whole car, two whole car, three whole car. It only makes sense to count them that way. So that makes it discrete numerical. Favorite chocolate of students in the class. That one is going to be categorical. Yeah, categorical, sorry. And highest temperature, we actually already had one that was temperature, which we talked about being continuous. Because we don't only have whole degrees, we can also have parts of a degree as well. Okay, one more. If you didn't have a go at that one by yourself, definitely pause here and have a go at this one by yourself. I'll give you the answers in a second. Weights of packages is that it's obviously going to be numerical. It's a number, kilograms, grams, whatever unit it happens to be in. And this is actually another example of continuous. Numerical. Because the value of the weight can be any fraction of a number, any decimal, it's fine to have something weigh 12.7 kilos. It's continuous. The number of text messages sent by someone in a day, though, that's actually an example of discrete. Again, because it's only possible to have whole number text messages. You can't send 0.46 of a text message. You're only sent 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. And brands of cereal, that one's categories. Categorical. Okay, that's types of data. Now we're going to look at where data comes from, and we've got two distinctions here. Primary source, which is data that comes from firsthand. For example, you are going to your classmates and asking them a series of questions on a survey. A secondary source is something that has come from someone else. For example, you look up something on the internet, you read something in a textbook, you read a newspaper or a magazine, you see something on TV. It's come from someone else and then you're using it. That's secondary. I'm going to do a few of these. I'm going to highlight primary in purple and secondary in green. Let's see. Looking something up on a website is a very clear example of secondary. A student surveying favorite sports is primary because the student is the one collecting the data that they're using. I'm going to get you guys to have a go at choosing what the rest of the things on there are. And yeah, pause if you need to. I'm going to throw up the answers in a second. So basically the ones that are primary here are just everything that a person is doing by themselves to collect data. Questionnaire could kind of go either way, depending on who is conducting the questionnaire. If it's you conducting a questionnaire, then that's primary. But if you're looking at the results of a questionnaire, for instance, online somewhere, that would be an example of secondary because you didn't actually conduct the questionnaire yourself. Government records is an example of secondary. The census is an example of secondary, and a textbook or a blog are also an example of secondary, unless you had written those yourself. Pause here, have a go at these three, and I'll give you the answers in a sec. Okay, here we are. That first one is secondary because that information would most likely be attained by looking at data collected by NASA or some other government body. It would be very difficult to get this information by you personally going around to every school and asking for that information. And again, this one is also secondary. Because it would be impossible for you to go around and collect this information on your own. You would rely on maybe ABS statistics, Australian Bureau of Statistics. Someone else would have gone out and collected that data. But this last one, this could be an example of a primary source. Because probably the best way to get the information on the number of chicken chippies consumed at Cessnock at lunch would be to go and stand at the canteen and see how many people buy chicken chippies. And that is an example of a primary source because you personally are collecting that data. Okay, last one. Ways of collecting data now. We're talking about census. Comes from everyone. That's the key thing there. For instance, in Australia, every few years we do a census where literally every single person contributes some information to that. But it can be on a smaller scale as well. For instance, we could survey all of year 8 and we would call that a census of year 8. A sample is where we take a portion of the population though, because it can be difficult to take a census of the entirety of a population, whereas it can be much easier to just pull out a small portion of that and ask them to respond only. So for instance, instead of surveying all of year 8, we just go to 8Y in PC one morning and ask 8Y what they think. The other thing we need to know here is that within the subset of samples, there are a couple different ways we can run our sample. We can just randomly choose people, put everyone's names in a hat and pull 5 out. Systematic is where you have some sort of system in place for how you choose your people. For instance, you line everyone up and you ask every fourth person to respond to the survey. You ask people that were born in February, June, October to be part of your sample. There's some kind of rule that you apply to your population that lets you choose the people for your sample. Stratified is slightly different in that you try and choose the participants in your survey so that they, as closely as possible, match the entire population. This is probably the hardest one to wrap your head around, but let me give you this example. There are, let's say, 100 students in year 8, and in total there are 60 boys and 40 girls. If we were going to do a stratified sample survey on year 8, we would choose 6 boys and 4 girls because it maintains the same proportion of the population in the whole year. That's a stratified sample. Okay, let's jump through a couple of examples of these. Would we use a census or a sample to collect data for the following? Census or a sample? If we were just going to get the height of students in the class, there might only be 20 of us, 25 of us. So in this case, it's not that difficult to just do a census and just collect data on everybody. But if we wanted to know the heights of all year 8 students in New South Wales, it would be very difficult to survey every single one of those because there is probably thousands. So it would make a lot more sense to maybe go to our school, maybe 1 or 2 other schools, and pull out a sample of some of the year 8 students. You guys have a go at the next one. Pause the video and I'll give you the answers in a second. Okay, census or sample, the number of pets of each student in the class. Again, because it's the class, it's very easy to just ask all 20 people and take a census of the pets that everyone has at home. But, sorry, that should say every. If we wanted to know what everyone in the school had, it would be much easier to, say, for example, pick 2 students from every year group and just sample a smaller portion of the population rather than asking all 1,100 and however many students we have currently. Let's think about now the type of sample that we're choosing. If we want to give someone from the class a prize, just pick someone out. We're going to make this random. But if we wanted to get a sample of the thoughts of middle school on the SPCC uniform, it would probably make much more sense here to use a stratified sample. Because if we had used a random sample there, there's a chance that we would have got only girls in our random sample, which wouldn't be very helpful because we want the opinion of some boys as well. Same thing if we used a systematic sample. We run the risk of not getting a good snapshot of what the whole of middle school thinks about the uniform. So a stratified sample would be the way to go here because the idea of that one is that it represents the population. Oh, sorry, that covers up. It says thoughts on the canteen food. You guys can have a go at these 2. And I'll give you the answers in a second. Okay, we're back. Again, this one is probably better to use a stratified sample. So we get a good representation of what the whole school thinks about the canteen. This is an example of a systematic sample. Because the system that we've imposed is checking every 100. All right, guys, I know that was a lot of new stuff, a lot of definitions, but what you're going to do now is you're going to find a maths-based task with the same name as this lesson that you can go ahead and practice. And by the time you've done that, we should be pretty comfortable with the different types of data, the different types of sources, and the different ways of collecting data. Thanks, guys.